All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Jessica Mozeico at Et Fille Winery in Newburgh. It's February 25th, 2020. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jessica.
Thank you for being here.
First question, most important question. Why wine?
My pathway into wine was entirely out of family loyalty. I absolutely never had on my radar to be involved in wine professionally. My background was in science. I always wanted to pursue science as a career and ended up in biotechnology. I was in biotechnology for about 10 to 12 years when my dad said to me, so I had been science major undergrad, had worked in biotechnology, went back to graduate school for my business degree, and then went on in biotechnology. And my dad called me one day and said that he had been making wine for 20 years as a hobby. I always helped him in the garage. And he said, you know, some people have said that I should really do this professionally, and I'm really thinking about it. And I said, that's a great idea. You should totally do that. And he said, you know, I could use a partner. First of all, I wouldn't really want to manage the business side of things, so I'd need somebody that was strong on the business side. Ideally somebody that's younger than me, because they'd probably take over the winemaking at some point. And, you know, I'd really like to do it with you. So we both plunked down $10,000 each and started Et Fille, and that's how we started. So my path into wine was because my dad was so passionate about it. He was getting so good at it, and I wanted him to continue and to pursue this as a professional endeavor, and I didn't think he'd do it if I didn't do it with him.
Tell me about his passion then. You've been making it in garage for a long time.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea where the passion bit him?
Yeah, and how? So he, first of all, as context, he grew up in the South Bronx as the Jewish son of two immigrants. His mother was the sole survivor in her family of concentration camps from Hungary. His father was originally from Lithuania by way of Mexico City because they couldn't get into the United States at that time. So he grew up in the South Bronx in not at all a wine-loving household. I mean, if you've ever had Morgan David, you would understand why wine would not be on your to-do list. And it wasn't until much later that he, he grew up working at Yankee Stadium. He was a hot dog vendor and worked his way through high school and college and went into the Peace Corps, and he went for training for the Peace Corps to Hawaii. While he was in Hawaii, he met a professor at the University of Hawaii and my mother and said, forget this Peace Corps, I'm staying here in Hawaii. And he pursued a graduate degree, and when he graduated, he needed to find a job in computer science. And you know, California, Oregon, Seattle, those were sort of the three places where he might land. My mom and dad looked at a map and thought, that Oregon seems great. So they came here when he got a job first with Tektronix. And so that software engineering job is what brought us to Oregon. We lived in Wilsonville. We had a neighbor who one day said, hey, you know, I have some sticks that need to go in the ground, and you could like grow a little vineyard with it. So here, just take these are just extra. And so he planted a little vineyard, and 3 years later, when it was time to do something, they are now growing. He said, by the way, now that they're growing grapes, how do I make wine? And the guy said, don't worry about it, that's really easy, it's no problem. Do you have a piece of paper? And my dad happened to have an envelope, you know, like had gotten the mail, and he said, sure. So he literally took the back of the envelope, and the guy said, there's really only 4 steps to winemaking, it's super easy. And so he wrote down the 4 steps, and that was his entree into starting to make it himself. Needless to say, after that, he started taking classes, started winning some amateur winemaking competitions, and had some mentors in the area that he enjoyed their wine and started asking them a lot of questions. So that's really how he did it, and for 20 years he planted his own vineyard. He also worked with he would volunteer at some local wineries, and in return for volunteering his time, he'd get access to buying some of their grapes. So he worked with a lot of wonderful vineyards very early on, and after 20 years was when they said, this is now getting ridiculous. You need to go do this on your own.
So before we get to that part of the story,
Yeah.
I'm curious, you mentioned working in biotechnology,
Yeah.
and I just want to ask a bit more about what you were working with and sort of what your passion was before wine.
Yeah, so my background, well, first of all, I was always interested in science, and early on I realized that as much as I was having a lot of fun in the dark in the lab with mice, I really needed to be around people. And so I became interested in my senior year in college in biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, essentially drug development for the purpose of testing hypotheses of certain disease models. But I didn't really know what that meant, and so I went into consulting for pharmaceutical and biotech clients, and was really fortunate, got to work on a lot of cool things really early on. Consulting is an up or out model, so you either go on to business school or, that's kind of the only path. So went to business school and knew that I wanted to pursue sales and marketing, or business unit leadership, in other words, for biotechnology. I worked primarily immunology, a little bit of oncology, and launched a few drugs, and it was a fantastic experience.
Did you have, before your dad called, did you have future ambitions in the same realm?
Yeah, all of my ambitions were around biotechnology. Like, I wanted to continue to, I led a franchise or a drug unit, and I wanted to continue to grow in that. And my passion was really about bringing new therapies to market that could help patients.
So tell me about the phone call from your dad. What was your initial reaction?
My first reaction was, you should totally do that. You need to go do that. And when I realized that, he really wants me to do this with him, I thought, sure, that sounds fun. Naively, I thought, how hard could it be? That sounds great. Yeah, sure, we'll start small. And we did. We started, we started in 2003, and we started with probably under 400 cases that first year, doubled that the next year, doubled that the next year. So it really was a few years where it was quite a manageable scale. I, at that point, was still living in San Francisco. It wasn't until 2008 that I left biotechnology and moved up here. And the impetus for that was that, my dad and I used to write our tasting notes that my dad would write kind of one line, very succinct, long finish, cherries, nice texture. And by the time I went to release tasting notes, these wines had all taken on a certain personality to me. So it wasn't uncommon that I would compare it to a celebrity or a brand. And one year I had said, this year's Willamette Valley is the Cameron Diaz of the lineup. It's pretty, light, accessible. And Cameron Diaz's mother read it, and she ordered a case. But I was off launching a drug, and so I didn't send it to her for like a month. And then I had this epiphany that I thought, wait a second. I haven't sent Cameron Diaz's mother's wine to her yet. We just had a feature article written about us in Wine Spectator. All of these opportunities are going to continue to pass us by if we don't take it seriously and step up. So I called my financial planner and I said, I am going to quit my job in about 25 minutes. You have 24 minutes to convince me if that's a really stupid decision. And he said, if this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to do. We'll figure it out. And so I went into my boss's office. We were working on, I had just been, we were announcing that I was promoted, and so we were reorging the whole team. And I started the meeting by saying, there's just one small detail about this plan that I need to tell you. I'm not staying. And I never looked back. So I moved to Oregon in 2008, and that was really the time point that my dad and I started working really hand in hand on the winemaking side of things. So up until that point, he had handled the winemaking, and I had handled the marketing and sales side. And at that point, from 2008 on, we started working on the wines together.
And the name Et Fille, why that decision?
Yeah, so it means and daughter. And when he was making wine as an amateur just for fun, the first year that I helped, we jokingly called it Et Fille because it was and daughter. I'm an only child, and you know how a lot of Burgundian producers will be whatever their last name is, Et Fille, so and sons. And so we just jokingly called it and daughter, and it stuck. So that's how we named it.
So tell me about the difference then for you from being away and working kind of on part of the job, but kind of in your own little silo, to being here and working hand in hand.
Totally different. Yeah, I mean, before 2008, I would come up for harvest, but that's very different. I'd come up for a long weekend, go back. It became very different. And one of the things that was just, so first of all, I had no background in winemaking before that. I learned entirely by doing. Everything that I learned about winemaking was from my dad. And he was self-taught too. So he had a background as a software engineer, and he just became interested in wine and learned by doing. And I learned by doing. So that's certainly the path that both of us took. We did not have an academic background for it. We did not intern at a bunch of different places. We had skin in the game. Any mistake we made was a mistake that was going to cost us our own money. And so we just learned by doing.
And tell me about that process. I'm curious, you obviously had a science background, so it wasn't foreign to you. But tell me about the process of actually being in the vineyard, being in the winery, seeing it happening for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the, there are certain things about my background that I think gave me a good platform, and certain things that were just night and day different. So the things that I think poised me well is, you know, we have only one shot a year to make a product that we want to try to optimize. So you have to pay attention. You have to pay very close attention to the details, to the differences. You have to write things down. You have to document things so that your memory is a little aided. And if you come into other vintages that you can say, wait, we dealt with something like this one time, hold on, wait, when was it? What was the situation? What did we do? Did we like the result? Did we not like the result? And what does that mean for this vintage? So that's one, is just paying attention. And I think any basis in the scientific method gives you the ability to just sort of be pretty linear about the process and to just pay attention. That's certainly one. The other is, I certainly feel very comfortable of being in a lab and being around trials and setting up trials. As kind of a business person, I feel very comfortable being analytical about our business, because this is something that's personal and is subjective, but yet you still have to be very analytical about the framework and analytical. You can't go all on gut, I like it, therefore we should, whatever it is. So those are three things that I think helped me well. Ways in which I was totally unprepared is just the basics of, it's not about making the right decision, it's about process and protocol and sanitization and just not letting any detail go you know, you can't be glib about any sort of detail. And it took me a long time to realize, oh wait, yeah, I may have screwed that addition up. I wasn't really paying as close of attention as I should have, or did I really clean that well? Because something's going on here. Was I really, what was my protocol for that? So that I learned a lot by doing things the wrong way. And the other part that was very difficult for me to wrap my head around is I came from a business where it was all about profit margin. And I came into a business that is a cash flow business and is a retail business. And it's about inventory turns, and it's about things that just took me a long time to get used to, is that success in business in a small family-owned winery is not necessarily the same success that I was used to. So it took me a long time to get used to that, and I'm still getting used to it.
Tell me about if you can remember, like the first time you made wine, or the first time you were in the cellar working with your dad. What did you think about the process? What intrigued you? What were you not prepared for?
So the part that intrigued me definitely was being able to set up trials and being able to say, there's no right answer. We did not have, we started in 2003, so I moved up here in 2008. So, we only had 8 years under our belt. There was no saying, oh no, we never do it that way. Any idea was fair game. So, hey, have we ever tried it this way? Have we ever tried whole cluster in this particular vineyard? Have we ever tried spontaneous fermentation in this particular vineyard? Well, let's try it, and then let's just make sure we always have a control so that we can be making educated decisions as we go. I loved setting up trials, and I still do. So that's the part that I love the most. The other part is blending trials. My dad and I used to do blending trials entirely and exclusively together, and we would start out with a very strategic framework of, okay, what is in our cellar? What's the input? What is our desired output? What is it that we think that what is sellable of certain tiers? And that would at least give us some rough framework. And then we would talk about each individual vineyard or cuvee that we were making, and talk about historically what have been the strengths and weaknesses, what would we like to try to achieve. So we had a strategic discussion first. So you have your hypotheses, and then you start tasting, and sometimes when you start tasting, that all goes out the window. But sometimes you know what you can stay anchored towards. So I loved that part of the process. So the first wine that I made by myself, so I came up here in 2008. 2008 was obviously a lovely vintage to jump in full time. 2009, I made my first wine by myself. I made our rosé, and we called it Fifi because I'm the daughter, and it was my baby, so I called it Fifi. Not commercially, but just we jokingly called, "Where's Fifi? Bring Fifi in out of the, no, take Fifi outside. Cool down Fifi." So that was my first time where I felt like I had decisions that were all mine to mess up. And I loved that piece of accountability.
So I assume your dad had developed a kind of a winemaking philosophy over the years, and I assume that some of that came to you. So I'm curious, how would you describe your winemaking philosophy now, and how does it maybe differ from his philosophy? Yeah,
so first of all, I think that my philosophy is probably very similar because it's all I've known. Like I said, I didn't intern in various different countries. I didn't have a strong academic platform for it. It's all I've known. I've known it now for 17 years, and I have a pretty good memory, and I take good notes. So it's a matter of being able to reference similar vintages or similar situations and talk to people. But I would say that our philosophy has remained pretty stable over time. So I never know how to describe our winemaking style when I'm asked. But I can tell you what I believe in, and I believe that wine should have authenticity, transparency, integrity. I believe that wine should honor time and place, and in so doing, it can really capture that moment and yet change over time.
So how, as you were kind of learning the process, how do you go about creating a wine that matches those are very noble goals? How do you create a wine that matches those?
So first of all, we have a very small estate vineyard, and then we manage blocks at 6 other sites, which essentially means those are not owned properties, but those are blocks that we have been with in all cases except for one for greater than 11 years. So these are blocks that we know, that we know the potential of that site. We know what we're trying to achieve. And so I think it's really a matter of being true to that, and of being true to what you believe are the strengths and weaknesses of that particular block and site.
Tell me about growing. You mentioned starting very small and growing kind of incrementally. Did that change once you were here full time? Did you take on a different? So tell me about growing the business and maybe what your goals were.
Yeah. So first of all, let me start with context. We, when we started the business, we started this out of love. Our idea was we want to do what we love with whom we love. We want this to be a family business, and as a result of that, that dictated a lot of choices that we made at the beginning and along the way. That meant that because we were doing it together and out of the joy of doing it, we kept things at a manageable scale. We were always entirely self-funded. So like I mentioned, we started the business by both plunking down a $10,000 check and just calling it, let's just start and see what we can do for a little while. And then we had to sell in order to, free up, have cash for the next vintage. So all along the way, we were always self-funded. That definitely controlled the rate of growth. Also, it's not as though we built a big winery and then had to fill it. We always have been involved in other facilities. So when we first started, we were at Medici for the first year, and then August Cellars opened. We moved to August Cellars, and we were there for 13 years. And what was great about that is it allowed us to grow at a very scalable pace, because we started out with this tiniest barrel room and grew to the largest barrel room. But we had flexibility. It's not that we built a facility and needed to pay it off, So that was a major portion of it. I then moved to the winery in 2017 to Hollerin Wines, which I'd love to come back to that, how we moved there. But that's also a place that is owned by Bill Hollerin, and he had some extra capacity, and so I moved in there. So I think that the fact that we started this as a love and as a family thing dictated many of the choices that we made, and also the rate of growth.
So let's talk about that move to Hollerin. Why there and why then?
So what had happened is my dad died very unexpectedly in 2017. So my dad was 70 years old, but I would say 70 years young. And he went outside to work on our tractor in the vineyard at home. And had an accident and died unexpectedly on April 13th, 2017. There was no way that in 1,000 years we could have seen any of that coming. I certainly felt like in that one moment that I lost my best friend, my business partner, and my dad. And for a long time after that, my only goal was to keep the business going just exactly the same as my dad and I had started. I didn't know anything different. So much had been, my foundation had been ripped out from under me, that I just wanted to keep things going kind of as stably as I possibly could have. And a few months after my dad died, Bill Hollerin, who owns Le Pavillon Vineyard, with whom we work with Le Pavillon, said to me, hey, if you could use a change of pace, I just built this new facility on Warden Hill Road. I have extra capacity, so if you need a change of pace, let me know. And I said, thanks so much, but I cannot handle any more change. Wait a second, what did you say? And he said, I have no idea. I don't know how it would work. I just know I have extra capacity, so if that's helpful to you. And so I moved there a few months later, and that ended up being a fantastic, fresh, clean start for me in a welcoming place with a tremendously supportive group of people.
So did it feel like, you mentioned a fresh, clean start, did it feel like it helped you move on to the next step of what had to happen?
Yeah, I think that if I would have stayed at August Cellars in the same building that my dad and I had always been together, the only thing that would be different would be that he isn't there. I don't know that I would have been able to, quote unquote, move on, whatever that means. I think that I always would have felt incredibly alone and sad. And I think being in a new place gave me an opportunity to to have new memories and to create them and create new protocols and create a new process and with new people that surrounded me. And there was not an anchor to my dad and I used to do this sitting right there. So I think that was a really important component for me.
Did you have any doubts in the aftermath of losing him so suddenly? Did you ever think about not going on with Et Fille?
No, I would say, so maybe in the first 24 hours. So specifically what happened is that after he died, the next day we went to a viewing. And Bill Hatcher, who is a founder of A to Z and owner of A to Z in Rex Hill, was a really good friend of my dad's and has always been a very close family friend. He drove me to the viewing, and after the viewing, we were in the car alone. And I said, at some point, we're going to have to talk about what am I supposed to do? And he said to me something that, we talk in the Valley about that we're a very collaborative spirit, but here's what collaboration really means. He said to me, no matter what you decide to do with the business, you will never be alone. I will never be your father, no one will ever be your father, but you will never have to make a hard decision and feel like you have no one to talk to. And then he kept showing up, and he meant it. And he would come over to my house once a week and say, all right, what's going on? What bills need to be paid? What's going on? What decisions do you need to make this week? So that's an aside about collaboration. But in that moment, I definitely felt like, how am I going to do it? But it was, how am I going to do it? It was never if I was going to do it. I felt that moving on without my dad was going to be difficult, but not moving on with the winery would be impossible. So for me, I felt that I had an honor and a responsibility to move things forward. And at that time, I only defined success as, let me just do it the same way we did it before. What I didn't realize is that slowly over time, I would be able to grow the business a little bit more. We've grown Et Fille, we've grown revenues 50% in 2 years. It's changed a lot. We have invigorated a lot of new energy into the brand. We are in what I call Et Fille 2.0, and it's really exciting. And I do feel that for me, I have a very clear sense of purpose of building this to an even greater potential than what my dad and I had built it to, and to building it even more. And the important part of that is that we stay very rooted in our legacy, and that we branch out.
And on the subject of legacy, tell me a little bit about your Gabriella wine.
Yeah, so the first year that we started the Gabriella was in 2015. So my daughter, Gabriella, was born in 2015. She is my miracle child. I was pretty old when I had her, and I had already been diagnosed with unexplained infertility and told that I could never have children, and failed lots of years of fertility treatment. And I got pregnant with her at age 42, and she came 2 months early. So when she was born, she and I lived in the NICU together for a month. And my dad came to visit in the NICU and said, hey, what do you think of adopting the French tradition of creating a wine to enjoy on a child's 21st birthday? And I was still in the hospital at that point. And I said, yeah, sure. Here, write down all the things you would do to make a wine that's meant to age, and I'll do the same thing. So we wrote it down, and we switched lists, and it was the exact same. So I stayed in the NICU, and he went and made the wine. And he made a small lot of Gabriella Cuvée that was meant for our family and friends to enjoy, and with enough for our club members, and that was it. Really small lot. And we thought it would just be a one-time thing. Right after he died, I started blending trials about a month after his death. And there were 3 lots that stood out to me in the cellar of, they were beautiful, but they needed a lot of time to age. And so at that point, I made the decision that the Gabriella would not be one point in time, a single vintage, but each vintage it would really it was meant to be our grand cru. How could we put our best foot forward? And so that's what it is. It's has historically been 2 or 3 vineyards that are combined for a wine that we feel is meant to age. I also give a portion of proceeds back from all sales of Gabriella back to the NICU where Gabriella and I stayed.
Why is that important to you to do that?
I feel like, if Gabriella had been, if Gabriella had been born 30 years before she would not be with us today. We had amazing medical care, and I feel that it's so important to give back and to make sure that other people who find themselves in an extremely vulnerable position of needing life critical services, that they receive that and that they have support.
So you've talked a lot about legacy today, about the legacy of your father, now the legacy of your daughter. Tell me about what you kind of envision the legacy of Et Fille to be as you look ahead, especially Et Fille 2.0.
Yeah.
What do you want the legacy to be?
Yeah. So, I think that when my dad and I started this winery, it was really about what we shared and wanting to bring that to other people. So my mom does not drink. She just never has, not interested. And so my dad and I always bonded over having a bottle of wine at dinner and the conversations and talking about the wine. And that was a critical component for us in our relationship. And we wanted to bring that to other people. Our story is about family. It's about, that's how we started. It's why we continue, and it's what we hope accompanies our wines when people take them home. Of sharing our wines with whomever they define as family. And so that's really what I want our legacy to be, is that I would like for our wine to be enjoyed with family, if it just helps appreciate your time together a little bit more with whomever you define as your family. That's really our goal.
Excellent. So I noticed on the wall over here you have your vineyards listed over there. So I know working with a lot of vineyards is something that's important to you and to how you make wine. So tell me about, you talk about long-term relationships with vineyards. Tell me about how you went about choosing vineyards you wanted to work with, and maybe what you were looking for among those.
So first of all, the first component of answering that question is that we've always looked at it as an overall portfolio. We believe that we have this blessing of being here in the valley, where we have this lovely diversity of soils right here, and viticultural areas that we think truly make for different textures and different components of the wine. So we first looked at it from an overall portfolio perspective, which is we want to have some Yamhill Carlton, some Dundee Hills, some Eola Amity. So that's the first component. The second component is that I have to give my dad entire credit for being able to see potential of sites. So he came on really early. I mean, with some of the sites. So some were kind of legacy sites. When we started our first year, we started with Seven Springs Vineyard and Palmer Creek Vineyard. Clearly, he was very aware of Seven Springs Vineyard, and I think the reason why we got to work with that vineyard was because my dad just kept calling and kept calling and kept calling every single week. And finally they said, if we just give you some of this, will you stop calling us all the time? And so part of that was persistent. Sites like Marsh Vineyard, it's a similar thing where we knew we wanted to work with that site, and it was just a matter of being relentless, I suppose. But then there were other sites that were new and emerging that we got on really early with, and I just have to give my dad credit for seeing potential of what those sites, how they could evolve. Palmer Creek Vineyard, we were first year that it was bearing fruit. Kalita Vineyard, second year. Fairsing Vineyard, first year. So there are sites that we just started with when it was they were quite young, and we've grown up together.
Do you know what it was he saw when we talk about potential? Do you know what it was he was looking for?
Yeah, I mean, because you couldn't taste any of the wines, but he was just looking at, well, what else is nearby with a similar aspect or orientation, and what is the best case scenario of how this could evolve. And he just spent a lot of time listening to the vineyard owners of what their vision was and what they were willing to put into the site.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, again, the long-term relationships and managing the blocks there. So tell me about how that's evolved in terms of what you want to get out of those grapes and how you kind of navigate that with the vineyard owners themselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel extremely blessed because we have fantastic vineyard owners where we are completely aligned in what we're trying to achieve from that site and what they think is possible from that site. So I think we're operating from a place of complete alignment, and that makes the details a lot easier in terms of my maybe day-to-day interactions with their vineyard management crews. And so I think that up front there's just that clear alignment.
So the 2019 vintage is going to be quite a bit different than some of the recent ones have been. Tell me about how that one is looking for you so far, and maybe what was different about it than the recent ones.
Yeah, so I'm really happy with the 2019 wines thus far. In tasting through, I'm really pleased with the flavors, with the textures. I'm really excited about them. Most of them are done with ML at this point, so I feel like I can start to have a sense of where they're headed, and I am delighted to have a little bit more acid than we've had in the last few years, and am very excited to have more moderate alcohol levels. It was about time, so I'm thrilled.
I'm curious for you on that note. Feeling confident in the winemaking itself. At what point did that kind of kick in? At what point did you feel comfortable making the decisions you had to make?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I feel totally confident ever. I feel comfortable, but I don't feel confident. That's probably two different things. I think if I ever felt confident, I'd be a little worried. But I feel totally insecure a lot, and part of that for me is the journey is that, I don't have the academic background. I didn't work on a bunch of other people's winemaking styles before focusing on our own. And, when my dad died so suddenly, we always knew that it would transition to me being 100% the winemaker, but we assumed that I'd have a really strong assistant by then or a really strong whatever. And we didn't have time to put those types of things in place. So I definitely don't feel confident, but I think that I have a strong network of people that I trust. and that I respect their palates, and that I am totally comfortable. This morning, I was doing an acid trial with Anna Matzinger because I really trust her palate and adore working with her. And for things like that, I call in friends that I love their palates. I'm very clear of what I'm trying to achieve with each of the wines. The how I get there in every single vintage is not at all clear to me. So I talk to people that I like what they do, and I just ask questions.
So you've talked about your very recent growth and also recent changes. So as you look ahead for Et Fille 2.0, what do you see as you look, say, maybe a decade into the future?
I would love to expand into, so first of all, I want to stay focused and stay true to the core Pinot that we have been working on. There's nothing that I really want to change in our Pinot program, which is 90% of what we do. I would like to start to experiment with a few other varietals. I've grown our rosé program, and I'd love to see what else we could do. So I'd like to continue to focus on our Pinot program, but expand a bit.
Anything particularly you want to share? You want to try with, or still a secret at this point?
I haven't made a complete decision yet. I haven't put the money down to make the decision yet.
Fair enough.
These are decisions in my mind.
What about with the industry in general? Obviously, you've been around it now for nearly 20 years. Tell me about what it looked like when you started versus what it looks like now.
Yeah. I mean, so when we started, we were about the 150th winery. Of course, now there are 787 in Oregon and over 600 in the Willamette Valley. So certainly it has changed, and I think that so it's changed in a couple different ways. The first is that when I was telling my friends from biotech that I was quitting to go do a winery in Oregon, they kept saying, they have wine in Oregon? So that's like north of Napa and Sonoma? So I think that the reputation that we have established and the esteem and regard for Willamette Valley Pinot is in a totally different place than it was when we started. So I love seeing that maturation. Secondly, I think that we have started to diversify in terms of, as we have new entrants into the market, we've seen a lot of diversification of business models, locations, varietals, and seeing that expansion, that it's not just classic traditional Willamette Valley Pinot Noir is another piece of expansion that's really exciting to see. I think our core opportunity is to how do we build upon the strong, in some ways Willamette Valley Pinot right now bucks a lot of trends in terms of growing at a growth rate that is disproportionate to the industry as a whole, and that's a tremendous opportunity that we have. So how do we continue to grow that and sustain that while also recognizing the emerging new varietals, et cetera, that create more diversity in our region? So I think that is a core element for us. And then we need to think about the culture piece of it too. I mean, I shared with you two examples of what collaboration means to me. One is Bill Hatcher, when my dad died, saying, "You're never going to have to make a decision alone. I will be here for whatever you need," and then showing up and being that. And then also Bill Holleran, after my dad dying, saying, "Hey, if you need to change a pace, I've got some space at my winery if you want to move in." And those are two concrete examples of what collaboration means and has meant. As we grow, I would sure love for our culture to still have this proof is in the pudding of how you show up for others and show up for your colleagues and how you lend support
What do you see as you look ahead for the industry? Do you have, again, like I say, a decade out, what do you see as it's obviously in the midst of change right now?
Yeah.
What's it going to look like in 10 years?
I really hope that I think we have so many opportunities right now to differentiate ourselves, not just for Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, but to really increase that and push that to the next level. We think that every stage along the way we thought, oh, this is so much better than where we came from, but it could get even better. So I think continuing to perpetuate and increase the reputation for Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, while also focusing on sparkling wine, Chardonnay, who knows what else, that really can be flagship, best in class. Not just we're doing it because we can, but we're doing it, and we're doing it outstandingly well.
We'll talk a little bit about selling wine, because clearly that's something you have a background in from the very beginning of this endeavor.
My biggest challenge.
And I'm curious, because you talked about in the beginning that your friends didn't even know that Oregon had wine, or basically where Oregon was on a map, and we've heard that obviously many times. So at that point, your difficulty is telling people that Oregon is making wine and that it's any good, and then selling it. Now you have kind of the opposite problem, where people know, but now you have a lot of competition. So tell me about how selling Oregon wine has changed, and what it's like selling Oregon wine now in 2020.
Yeah. So, okay, first of all, I think that while we think that it's different, it really isn't. And here's what I mean by that. I remember maybe 10 years ago, okay, so there's 787. Let's say 10 years ago, I'm making this up, there were 500 brands. But we were still at only producing 1% of total U.S. wine production. Now we're at 1.5%. So really, who cares? You're talking 1/500th of 1% versus 1/787th of 1.5%. It's still whatever. It's still, the opportunity is really to grow the category. So for me, I actually don't think that it's changed that much. I think that the imperative that we all benefit from is growing the category, period. And I think, we've seen a lot of things in the past year about how do we grow with an emphasis and focus on quality. And we've seen lots of different initiatives, whether it was with labeling or other initiatives, of how do we make sure that there's some quality control to protect that which we are able to charge a price premium for. So I think that's one component. In a way, I don't think it's changed that much.
How is it for you now, if you go outside of Oregon, selling Oregon wine? What's the reception like?
Well, now I'm just delighted because they actually know, they have some expectation of what they should expect from a Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. They have some expectation that they might expect to pay a little bit more for the Willamette Valley Pinot Noir than the Sonoma Pinot Noir that they have on their list. So I really appreciate that there is that kind of overall appreciation. The vast majority of my business is still direct to consumer, so I do feel a little bit protected from some of the market share concerns, but it's certainly an issue for all of us. We don't have Thanksgiving weekend and Memorial Day weekend in the same way that we used to 10 years ago.
You mentioned the DTC, which of course is a lot of people, that's what a lot of people are selling their wine right now. How have you built that base, and how has that come along as Et Fille has grown?
So I think this is part of what goes back to what I think has separated Et Fille 2.0 from Et Fille 1.0. So in Et Fille 1.0, a lot of our values or decisions, they were just sort of, my dad and I knew what we were trying to do, and we didn't even need to articulate it. We didn't need to communicate it to anybody else. We just, let's say, I'm just going to use a hypothetical, let's say that a new vineyard was available. We wouldn't even really need to go through the whole articulation of the whole thing. We'd be like, no, 3 Amhill Carltons already, don't need another one, okay. So it was just very quick. We had a shorthand way of communicating. And we were, at that time, we had not opened this tasting room yet. We were open by appointment only in our barrel room. So in order for somebody to actually try our wines, they had to call me on my cell phone, make an appointment with me, and come at a time that worked for me to meet me in our barrel room. So there were a lot of barriers and hurdles. Or they would come to our, to a holiday weekend open house. In Et Fille 2.0, we have the tasting room open. We're a little bit easier to find. And the other thing that I needed to do about a year and a half ago, I was having a staff meeting, about 4 of us, and 4 plus me. And I looked around the room and I thought, oh, nobody was here when my dad was here, or only one person was. So I wrote what I call the Et Fille ethic, which is, here's why we do business. This is what we do. This is what we believe wine should be. This is how we believe we should, kind of our values. And I wrote a statement of 5 statements of what the Et Fille ethic would be, because I realized that it was very important that if we want to honor our history and stay rooted in our legacy, we needed to write it down, and we needed to be concrete and transparent about it. That's number 1. Number 2, because we had a tasting room and because it wasn't just my dad or me greeting guests, our customer makeup changed. So, we say that we have 3 main customer types. We really only have 3 customers at Et Fille, and we kind of have a little bit of a portrait of what the needs are and what the demographics are of each of those customers. And in the old days, in Et Fille 1.0, when it was just my dad and I, we had people that looked a lot like my dad that were boomers, retirees, and we had people that looked a lot like me that were moms and kind of working people, and we didn't have what I consider our 3rd customer type, which is double income millennials that are really focused on having a unique experience, that want wine that they can share with their families or with their friends that they consider their families. So I think that 3rd customer segment is because I have an energy level in my tasting room of people that bring in that energy level.
So you obviously took an interesting route into wine, and a very unique one. But if someone were to come to you, and I'm sure this probably has happened, if someone were to come to you and ask for your advice on getting into the Oregon wine industry, what were the words of wisdom you would share with them?
I would say, number 1, if you want to do it, do it. Just do it. Start making. That's the only way you make your own mistakes. It's the only way you're really going to learn. So really just do it. Number 2, find those voices that you respect and those palettes that you respect, and ask a ton of questions. And number 3, be really concrete about why you want to do it, and that will frame the how you can do it. For us, because it was about doing what we loved with whom we love, that framed the choices that we made. We were never going to bring in outside investors. We were never going to take out a lot of debt. That wasn't why we did this.
That's all the questions that I have for you today, Jessica. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover that we should have covered?
I don't think so.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time, for sharing your stories, and those of your fathers as well. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook here.
Okay.